So basically, we're gonna do a pretty generous drum setup here. It's gonna be about 14 or 15 microphones in this room. Everything from close miking to some room miking. This room isn't huge, but we'll kind of go over how I kind of make the room to appear larger on the recording, which will be fun. Some of that will happen today during recording, and some of it will happen later during mix down of the drums itself. But definitely everything starts here in this room with microphone choices. So I'm really big on microphone choice and placement when producing and recording drums. In other words, I don't use a ton of EQ and compression on the way into the console. I use some. I don't use a ton. I really work very hard for the microphones to do the work for me. Kind of a smarter, not harder approach. So we're gonna go over a lot of that today while we set these drums up. So our drummer's already got his drums in place and feeling good. That's the first thing, is I always ask the drummer to put your drum set up and make you feel comfy, because as I place microphones around him, the last thing I kind of want is for him to come in here and be like, oh, I actually wanted my floor tom this way or that way, because it's gonna mess up all of my phase correlation and basically all the work that we've done to get the drum set to sound good on the mics. So first things first, we're gonna go ahead and do a D112 on the inside of the kick drum. This mic is like, you see this mic on the inside of kick drums all the time. Mainly because of the attack and its low end response. So it kind of has two purposes as to why it's so good on inside kick drums. It really gets a lot of the beater while also being able to get a lot of the low end, which is difficult sometimes for microphones being so close inside of a kick shell. Now you are gonna see, as I set these up, I'm not going to put final placements on these until I hook up microphone cables. U87 is gonna go on the outside of the kick drum. We'll also eventually build a kick drum tunnel. This room, I find, because this room is a bit shorter and not as long, if we don't build a kick drum tunnel in here, I find that the room mics that we're gonna set up eventually pick up too much of the kick drum. In other words, like the room mics end up being just a room kick drum rather than a room microphone for the set. So later on, we're gonna build a tunnel to go around it and over it so that the kick drum is isolated from the room itself. To get a more focused sound on the kick drum and also a more focused sound on the room mics. So the kick drum's gonna end up having 3 microphones on it: kick in, kick out, and kick sub. The kick sub mic is basically just a reversed speaker, and this is really just picks up, you'll hear it eventually. Essentially, this is only picking up extreme low end. So we're talking basically from probably 200 hertz down, and in general, I'll only end up using it truly for probably 50 hertz down. So in other words, if we think about it correlating from right to left, as microphones I have here, D112 is gonna be used for the attack of the kick drum and the punchiness of it. The outside kick drum, which is the U87 here, is gonna be used for general shell resonance and some low end, but a different low end, not a subby low end. Low end probably that lives more from 50 to 150, so a little bit more of that low mid punch. And then the kick sub, which is the reversed Yamaha speaker, will be living really from 60 hertz down, maybe 65 hertz down. So you can see the arrangement of kick drum mics here and how they're all gonna play together. Anytime I have multiple microphones on any sound source, whether it be a drum or a guitar cab or what have you, if there's gonna be multiple microphones on something, they all have to serve their purpose. So I don't just put a bunch of mics up just for more sound, because that just gets louder, and honestly, it's just a phase nightmare. There always has to be purpose. So in other words, as we go through the drum set, I'll explain why I'm choosing certain mics for certain things, but the kick drum, definitely, this is why these 3 microphones are on here. There's purpose. And again, what that's gonna do is alleviate some of the intense EQing or compression we have to do, because each microphone is gonna be doing a lot of work for us. We're gonna leave those alone for now before we're hooking them up, and we're gonna move to the snare drum. Snare top, I've concocted this thing right here, which is an M201 taped to an M81. It is a Biodynamics M201 and a Telefunken M81. These, again, both have very different frequency ranges as to what they're gonna be doing. So the M201 is gonna be more focused on top end sizzle. An M201 I would liken to basically a souped up SM57. It sounds very similar, but the mid-range is slightly different. A little bit more realistic, I find. Personally, I find 57, while I love a 57 and I use them all the time on things, sometimes in a snare drum I can find them to be a little bit too cracky in the mid-range. and a little bit too out there, especially with Dash, who plays really hard. So there's gonna be no shortage of mid-range crack on the snare drum. If I was recording a drummer that may be a little lighter with his right hand or left hand, I may opt for 57. We'll eventually be putting this in between the hi-hats ever so gently, but like I said, right now, just getting it in place, not placing it, just getting it to where we think it's gonna be, so when I hook up the cables up, we can actually do a real mic placement. Cool. For the snare bottom, we're gonna keep it simple and also do a 201. It's, like I said, it's got great top end and really level mid-range. The snare bottom is, to me, just as much about capturing some of the kick drum than it is about the snare bottom itself. I mean, you know, I definitely filter out any low end from it because I don't necessarily want low end coming from here because it's gonna get muddy. What I do want is some of that rattle from the snares and some of the inside beater. So while this is labeled snare bottom on my input list in the session, it's definitely going to be getting a little bit of everything for us. We're gonna use the 421s for toms. Again, these are pretty classic. I mean, you know, I'd say 75% of the times you're recording toms, you end up putting 421s on here. These just sound great on toms. They have great attack, they have great low end, they take EQ really well, and they take compression probably even better. You'll see later on, if our placement is correct, which we will get it right, even though these tom drums are gonna be, or these tom mics are placed realistically in the middle of the set, we won't be picking that much of the set up when placed correctly and gain stage correctly. So we'll place that later. We may need some extra room to get that guy right. We may need to mess with that later. We're gonna do the hi-hat next, really easy. Not a big hi-hat microphone fan, if I'm being honest. Like, in other words, I don't use them a whole lot in a mix all the way through, but it's great to have, one, for beat detecting and editing, and two, it's really great to have for parts when we want to highlight a hi-hat groove, like in a verse if we're doing 16ths or something, you know, pattery or something like that, to really amp up the hi-hat mic a little bit, and then we can pull it back down when things get louder and we're not on the hi-hat mic anymore. So, but again, it's used a lot for editing and even more to highlight grooves inside of a mix if we want to get more particular. I like to use an SM7 for this, mainly because an SM7B is a little bit darker and there will be no shortage of high-end aggressive stuff coming off of this hi-hat. I even keep the pop filter on here, again, just to alleviate any like really aggressive and abusive stuff which we can equate to, you know, 10K and up. This will kind of make it sit in the mix a little better, and it kind of almost, having this on almost gives it its own natural EQ. I guess actually the overheads, we're not gonna measure these yet. Again, we're just placing. These are 4038s, a Cole's 4038s. These are ribbon mics. So obviously with ribbon mics, we don't want 48 volts on phantom power because we will be popping the ribbon if we do that. But the reason I use 4038s typically on overheads, again, with rock music, I wanna specify that over and over again because the choices that I make are very specific to the genre that I'm producing, in this case, rock. Typically in rock music, we have really heavy hitters, right? People that are just absolutely slamming snares and cymbals and just going really, really hard. Ribbon mics, specifically these 4038s I find, help tame that. So as Dash, or insert rock drummer, is just absolutely wailing on a crash cymbal here, it never gets abusive or out of control with 4038s, or with a ribbon overhead, I should say. We're doing spaced pair today. I'll measure them a little bit later, but again, right now, just getting them in general order. But that is the reason I'm doing ribbons on the overheads, and that I very often do ribbons on the overheads. Again, alleviating some of the EQ work that we're gonna have to do. If we had really bright microphones up here, and then later on, we're like, wow, it gets to a point where it's probably unlistenable if you use really high density condensers and things of that nature, at least to my ears anyway. These ribbons will kind of do some of the work for us. And like I said earlier, we really want the microphone choice and placement to be doing most of the work for us, you know? We don't want to have to resort to heavily EQing or compressing things if we don't need to. This is a great example of that. Again, we'll measure those in a little bit. We'll get our tape measure out and get very, very, very mathematic with that. So now going off of what I just said relating to the ribbons, we're gonna be using in the rooms, this is the room stereos, we're gonna be using 414s, which are polar opposites of what I would say a ribbon microphone is, specifically a 4038. 414s are known to me anyway, and most of the community as being a little brighter. They're condensers, so they're gonna generally be brighter, and the thing I like about these in rooms is that it's almost like that I'm almost blending the room stereos and the overheads as one sound. So these are kind of making up for some of the top end that I may not necessarily have in the Coles, if that makes sense. And vice versa. The Coles are making up for a little bit of the low, mid, dark stuff that these aren't going to provide. So they really become one sound, even though the distance is different, obviously, and they're picking up different parts of the room and the set, they really end up kind of being blended together as one sound. It's actually incredible to me when I have both these sets up, if I mute one set, how crazy that sounds. Like it almost like the drum almost falls apart a bit. So it's very important that these two work together, and going off of that, we're gonna have to check phase between the two sets later on pretty closely, because again, we're gonna be using these sort of as one sound. I'll measure these in a moment after I get up all the microphone cables. Do this over here, we're doing left to right. We're doing drummer's perspective, so hi-hat left, floor tom right. It's pretty typical for me.